The first thing the headlights caught wasn't chrome, paint, or the familiar flash something abandoned. It was a dull sheen, almost swallowed by the dark. As if the black bodywork were trying to blend into the forest itself, the hiker stopped mid-step, his flashlight shaking slightly, because the shape made no sense where it was. A low, aggressive hood, tight wheel arch, a silhouette designed for clean asphalt, not for ferns and fallen branches. And yet the Porsche sat there, wedged between trees, less than 50 meters from the constant hum of the highway, the steady breath of passing tires, like someone had parked for a moment and then simply vanished. As he moved closer, what stood out wasn't decay, but restraint. No thick webs stretched across the mirror, no nest clogged the vents, no heavy mat of rotting leaves fused to the door. There was dirt, yes, and long scratches along the side, the kind branches leave behind. But the car looked oddly preserved, neglected with intention. The driver's window was intact, the interior, visible through the glass, hadn't been stripped. Even the crest on the front wheels still caught the light. Hanging from the rearview mirror was a laminated card, faded but readable, with a face he recognized instantly. Not personally, but the way certain faces become public property through repetition. Amelia Harper. When he pulled the door handle, it opened with a dry snap, slow groan of aging rubber, like it had been opened before and closed carefully. The smell inside wasn't rot. It was leather, dust, and something faintly sweet, old tea, maybe. In the glove compartment, folded by hand and held with a brittle rubber band, was an envelope marked with a date in pen. 11/17/2019. No signature, just the date, the day she disappeared. On the passenger side floor sat a cut plastic bottle, reshaped into a makeshift funnel, its edges worn from use. This didn't feel like a relic dug up by chance. It felt like a scene left paused. He didn't hear footsteps in the wood. He heard something else, a short, sharp sound from the direction of the highway, like a switch being flipped. He turned instinctively, and only then noticed what his senses had dismissed for being too ordinary. A smell of smoke, not wildfire smoke, domestic smoke, slow, burning wood. His flashlight traced the source, catching a thin thread rising straight up before dissolving into the cold air. He followed it a few steps, the highway noise swelling, fading like breathing, until he saw the structure that shouldn't have been there. A small cabin made of mismatched board, so close to the road that a shift in the wind carried the taste of diesel. The cabin door wasn't locked. A rope was tied outside, a simple mechanism to pull it shut from within. On the frame, fingerprint, human grime, not random mud, marked the spots where hands opened and closed it daily. He knocked once, hoping for no answer, bracing for one anyway. Something scraped inside, careful and controlled, and then a voice came through the door, rough but steady, practiced not to shake. "Did you come alone?" He swallowed hard because he recognized the voice before he saw the face. When the door opened just a crack, a pale eye appeared in the dim light, measuring the distance to the highway as if 50 meters were an ocean. What follows is not a continuous account, nor a late confession, nor an attempt to reconstruct emotion. It is a reconstruction by assembly. The disappearance of Amelia Harper exists only in fragments, official reports that don't fully align, maps that contradict one another, technical records that stop short of clarity, interviews conducted long after memory should have been trusted. The discovery in 2025 did not resolve the case. It destabilized. What once looked like a closed timeline broke into gaps that could no longer be ignored. From the beginning in 2019, the case was framed as high value and low noise. There were initial search, formal statement, a brief surge of media interest. Within months, the file was labeled "no new lead," a phrase that functioned less as a description and more as an anesthetic. The investigation remained open in name only. Files existed, but they no longer spoke to each other. GPS coordinates failed to match search claim. Timestamps overlapped in ways that made no logistical sense. Areas described as thoroughly cleared appeared nowhere in verified movement log. This investigation starts from a premise that is both simple and uncomfortable. Proximity does not guarantee visibility. The cabin found 50 meters from the highway was not hidden by sophisticated camouflage or extreme terrain. It operated under a logic of minimal normal controlled smoke, no noise, limited waste. The kind of presence that goes unnoticed precisely because it doesn't violate any explicit rule. That detail shifts the case. The question is no longer how someone survived there, but why no one ever looked closely enough to notice. Official versions begin to fracture at exactly the points where they should be most solid. The hiker's account, though detailed, was taken under intense public pressure. Statements from officers involved diverge on specific, exact time, chosen route, reasons certain areas were excluded. Traffic data shows repeated sensor failures along the same stretch of road. None of this, taken alone, proves intent or misconduct. Together, it suggests something quieter and more durable, a pattern of administrative comfort where simple explanations are accepted because they allow a case to end. From here on, each chapter dismantles one of those explanations. If you want to follow this reconstruction as it moves forward, if you want to see where the records stop holding and where the story actually breaks, then you need to stay with it. Subscribe now. This case will not be told all at once, and it will not offer easy closure. The next parts introduce inconsistencies that fundamentally change how everything before them should be read. If you step away here, you miss the moments where the investigation truly comes undone. Subscribe, follow along, and continue this investigation with me. Because what happened 50 meters from the highway only makes sense when someone refuses to accept silence as an ending. Amelia Harper's disappearance began the way many high-profile cases do, with an excess of early attention and a shortage of uncomfortable questions. On the evening of November 17, 2019, she left her residence driving her black Porsche, according to home security logs, shortly after 7 p.m. There was no public schedule, no confirmed meeting, no indication of urgency. The last message sent from her phone was brief and utilitarian, stripped of emotion. There was no reply after that. From the start, this absence of continuation was treated as evidence of a sudden event, an accident, a fast-moving crime, something that could explain a clean break. Those first hours quietly set the boundaries of everything that followed. Investigators assumed linear movement. Amelia left, entered the highway, and continued forward. Search efforts focused on probable routes, major exit, known risk areas. Helicopters covered long stretches of terrain. K-9 units were deployed at locations selected by analysts who never walked the ground themselves. What stands out now is not what was done, but what was deemed unnecessary. Areas too close to the highway were deprioritized under a simple logic: no one vanishes there. The founding anomaly appears precisely at that decision point. Traffic data shows that on the night of the disappearance, a specific highway sensor experienced a brief outage between 7:18 and 7:27 p.m. The interruption was logged as routine. Sensors failed. The detail that went unexamined was location. That sensor sat only meters from where the Porsche would later be found. In 2019, the overlap was dismissed as coincident. No supplemental search was ordered. No adjustment was made. The data point was absorbed and forgotten. Ground searches officially concluded after 11 days. The closing report states that all accessible and relevant areas were thoroughly examined. That exact sentence appears in 3 separate documents, signed by different individuals. None of them include detailed route map. None contain individual GPS log. There is only the assertion. Years later, when asked to clarify, some officers said the data had existed but was lost during a system migration. Others said they trusted the collective memory of the team. None of those explanations can be verified now. But the anomaly is not confined to paperwork. It sits in the logic itself. From the outset, investigators worked from the assumption that Amelia could not have stopped voluntarily so close to a busy road without being seen. That assumption was never tested. It was accepted. As a result, the simplest possibility, pulling over, walking a short distance, entering the tree line, was excluded for being too ordinary for a case this large. The disappearance was framed as complex, while the nearest explanation was ignored. Financial silence reinforced that framing. There were no suspicious withdrawals, no irregular transfers, no attempts to access account. To some, this suggested rapid death. To others, sophisticated plan. Rarely documented was a third option: lack of need. If Amelia was alive but had no intention of leaving, money would have had no immediate function. That possibility conflicted with the image of control that defined her public profile, and so it never gained traction. The informal closing of the case produced a secondary effect that would prove critical. The area stopped being an area of interest. The highway remained active. Routine maintenance continued. No authority revisited that stretch with genuine curiosity. For years, people passed within meters of where the car sat sealed, relying on the assumption that if something were wrong, someone else would have noticed already. That assumption doesn't appear in reports. It governs decisions all the same. This first chapter ends without a chase, without confirmed violence, without spectacle. It ends with an administrative choice to stop looking. That choice hardened every interpretation that came after it. When the Porsche resurfaced in 2025, it wasn't just an object returning to view. It was proof that the anomaly was never in the wilderness or the passage of time, but in the exact place the investigation decided not to examine. There is one final detail, buried in an appendix rarely cited from the 2019 file. A junior officer noted, in handwriting rather than type, a faint smell of smoke during a nighttime patrol near the highway. The observation was dismissed for lacking visual confirmation. It was never followed up. It was never properly digitized, and it was never considered relevant until the cabin was found exactly where that patrol had passed. The informal reopening of the case did not begin with an official directive, but with a growing sense of unease. After the Porsche was found in 2025, analysts reviewing the file noticed something that had gone unremarked for years, the repetition of small failures that had each been dismissed as inconsequential. None of them alone warranted suspicion. Together, they formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Patterns, after all, only emerge when someone decides to line events up instead of letting them sit apart. The first recurrence involved traffic sensors. The stretch of highway near the disappearance showed intermittent outages dating back to 2017, not prolonged failures, brief lapses, often under 10 minutes, routinely classified as momentary instability. When plotted over time, the outages appeared too frequently in the same narrow corridor to be random. More unsettling was their overlap with vague, undocumented comments from nearby residents about something off that never rose to the level of a formal report. Those residents' observations followed a peculiar rhythm. A gas station attendant said she never noticed anything unusual, then later added that she sometimes smelled smoke, but that's normal. A long-haul driver recalled pulling over repeatedly in that area due to an undefined sense of discomfort, never associating with danger. Another resident mentioned seeing a stationary shadow near the tree line on multiple occasions, then dismissed the memory as too strange to take serious. The consistency wasn't in the detail, but in the collective hesitation to translate perception into action. Maintenance records added another layer. Third-party crews performed routine work along the highway for years, yet their reports showed something odd. Repeated, brief stops at the same location, logged as standard check. No photographs, no itemized findings, just arrival and departure time. When questioned later, supervisors claimed no specific recollection. The precision of the repetition suggested otherwise. Something had drawn attention and been deliberately deprioritized. A psychological pattern surfaced as well. In post-2025 interview, officers involved in the original search used remarkably similar language to justify early decision. It didn't seem plausible. It didn't fit the profile. It wouldn't make sense. These phrases revealed a shared cognitive shortcut, the rejection of simple explanations because they clashed with the narrative weight assigned to the victim. The idea that someone like Amelia could disappear in a banal way was discarded not by evidence, but by discomfort. As the review widened, parallels emerged with other cases, not identical, but structurally similar. Disappearances near populated areas, searches focused farther out, closures justified by a lack of significant indicator. In each, minor signal, smell, sound, objects out of place, were noted and then set aside. None pointed to conspiracy, they pointed to habit, an institutional tendency to look past what feels too close to be meaningful. In Amelia's case, that habit compounded over time. Each year, without new developments, reinforced the belief that nothing had been missed. The road became familiar, neutral, invisible. Proximity dulled curiosity. That is how the cabin persisted. Not hidden, but textualized within routine. It belonged to a landscape no one felt required a second look. One detail sharpened this conclusion. Traffic analysis revealed drivers slowed slightly along that stretch more often than on comparable roads. Not enough to cause congestion, not enough to register as an anomaly on its own. No accidents explained it, no construction justified it. It was a collective micro-adjustment, noticed, enacted, and never articulated. Satellite imagery added the final recurrence. Over several years, subtle changes appeared in the vegetation near the cabin site. Faint clearing, paths that formed and vanished. Signs of use calibrated to avoid permanent, not a trail, not a campsite. Evidence of regular presence, carefully erased. Someone had been there often enough to leave marks, and careful enough to remove them. By the end of this phase, the question had shifted. It was no longer whether Amelia had been alive there for years. The indicators aligned too tightly to deny it. The question became how many times the environment had signaled that presence before anyone chose to look closely. If the patterns were visible only when aligned, then the disappearance had not been sustained by isolation, but by repeated decision not to connect dots. This chapter closes on an uncomfortable realization. Invisibility here was cumulative. And if that's true, the next step cannot rely on data alone. It must confront the instability of human account. Because when patterns exist, someone always notices before they become statistics. The question is, who noted and why they didn't write it down? When the investigation shifted from data to human account, the apparent stability of the case began to fracture. Unlike sensors or log, people do not fail in uniform ways. They hesitate, they revise, they forget selectively. The first round of interviews conducted in 2019 appeared internally consistent on paper, but when those same statements were revisited in 2025, a strange effect emerged. The accounts did not directly contradict one another, yet they no longer aligned when placed side by side. One officer stated that the area near the highway had been checked quickly but sufficiently. Another insisted it had never been prioritized because it was too visible. A third claimed K-9 units had searched that exact stretch, while the K-9 unit's own deployment records show the dogs were directed miles deeper into the forest. None of these statements, taken alone, can be proven false. The conflict only appears when they are arranged into a single timeline. Something is always missing. Something never quite fits. Among local residents, the pattern repeated in subtler form. A woman working at a nearby gas station said in 2019 that she had never noticed anything unusual. In 2025, when shown photographs of the area, she added almost casually that there had been smoke sometime, but that's normal around here. A truck driver recalled stopping multiple times along that stretch because of an undefined sense of unease, though he never connected it to danger. Another resident mentioned seeing a figure that didn't move near the tree line on more than one occasion, then dismissed the memory as too strange to take seriously. The written records were more troubling. A night patrol report noted no indication of human activity. An appendix attached to the same document, signed by a different officer, referenced possible unidentified interference during the patrol. The term was never defined. No follow-up was ordered. The note simply vanished from subsequent paperwork as if it had been absorbed without consequence. As investigators compared these versions, one detail became impossible to ignore. Everyone believed someone else had looked more close. Field officers trusted aerial sweep. Aerial teams relied on ground report. Residents assumed law enforcement would notice anything serious. Law enforcement assumed that if something truly mattered, someone would have insisted. The result was a closed loop of assumed responsibility, where no single person felt accountable for examining what was close. This marks the first major rupture in the narrative. Contrary to long-held belief, there was no firm consensus in 2019 about what had actually been done. There was only the appearance of consensus. When confronted in 2025 with specific discrepancies, several officers acknowledged, off the record, that certain possibilities were set aside to avoid overcomplicating the case or spreading resources too thin. Those admissions never appear in formal documentation, but they force a rereading of the original closure. More unsettling still is how some accounts seem to have evolved over time. Later interviews sound more synchronized than the original ones, as though a functional story had gradually replaced fragmented memory. This does not necessarily imply deliberate deception. It suggests something more common and more dangerous. Memory shaped by institutional repetition, where coherence becomes more important than accuracy. The conflict reaches its peak with the discovery of the cabin itself. One report claims the structure did not exist during earlier search. Another argues that temporary structures were considered unlikely. A third suggests environmental change could explain its later appearance. None of these explanations withstand the physical reality of the site's proximity to the highway. The contradiction lies not in the fact, but in the effort to explain why those facts were not seen. By the end of this phase, the investigation identifies no single lie, no clear villain, no decisive moment of failure. What it finds instead is a system in which conflicting versions coexist without being challenged, as long as they support the impression of resolution. Amelia Harper's disappearance endured not because of one falsehood, but because of many partial truths that were never forced to confront one another. And it is this realization that drives the next shift in focus. If records bend, if accounts converge after the fact, if memory adapts to preserve closure, then the next question is no longer what was ignored, but what happened once ignoring was no longer possible. Because the discovery of the cabin did more than contradict old statements, it triggered a consequence that could not be undone. The consequence of the discovery was not immediate, but it was irreversible. Once the existence of the cabin became public, no institution involved could maintain the earlier narrative without visible strain. This was no longer a matter of reopening an old case. It was about explaining how something so close to ordinary life had remained outside every line of sight for years. From that moment on, silence gave way to defensive motion. The first impact was administrative. Requests for internal reports multiplied. Deadlines tightened. Preliminary summaries were replaced with carefully worded statements. The language shifted almost overnight. Where reports once said exhaustive search, they now read search consistent with protocols in effect at the time. Where there had been no indication, there were now no indications detectable with available method. None of this added clarity. It simply redistributed responsibility across time. The most visible consequence, however, was physical. The area around the cabin was sealed off abruptly. Tape, cone, patrol vehicles, a space that had existed quietly for years, was suddenly treated as critical infrastructure. The contrast drew immediate attention from residents and local media. People recognized the location not as unfamiliar, but as something they had passed countless times. "I drive by there every week," became a common refrain. Familiarity, in retrospect, made the oversight harder to tolerate. Examination of the cabin confirmed prolonged habitation, layers of repair, objects replaced over time, adjustments made for durability rather than comfort. There was no luxury, no obvious desperation. There was routine. That detail forced an irreversible shift in interpretation. If Amelia had lived there for years, the disappearance could no longer be framed as an extended emergency. It had been a stable condition. That reality invalidated most of the assumptions that shaped the original investigation. Legal consequences followed quickly. Attorneys began questioning not isolated misstep, but the early closure itself. Terms like negligence and failure to act appeared in formal correspondence. Still, no agency accepted direct fault. The result was paralysis. Everyone acknowledged something had gone wrong, yet no one could identify the moment when the line was crossed. That uncertainty was itself irreversible. The erosion of institutional credibility could not be undone. On a human level, the impact was quieter, but just as telling. Officers involved in the 2019 search began privately reassessing past decisions, not to correct them, but to reconcile them internally. Some requested transfer, others withdrew from comment entirely. There were no immediate disciplinary actions, but there was movement. Systems reorganized when they sense exposure. The confirmed presence of Amelia produced another unavoidable consequence. All previous theories had to be re-examined under a single, undeniable fact. She had been alive, not for days or weeks, but for years. That acknowledgement rendered earlier debates about accidents, immediate abduction, or sudden death largely irrelevant. The investigation was forced into more unstable territory. The question of intent. This was where resistance hardened. Official documents began using deliberately neutral phrases. Circumstances under review. Motivations undetermined. Psychological state unclear. Each phrase functioned as a buffer to suggest that Amelia remained there by partial choice, or under conditions she had learned to navigate, would mean admitting that the failure was not only technical, but conceptual, that investigators had accepted explanations because they were comfortable. The final consequence of this phase was a shift in axis. The case was no longer about an unsolved disappearance. It became about an ignored present. That distinction could not be reversed. Regardless of legal outcomes, the fact remained. A person existed in plain proximity to daily life and was rendered invisible not by distance, but by assumption. This chapter closes at the moment the investigation confronts its own boundary. From here on, proving error was no longer sufficient. Understanding persistence became essential. Between the highway and the cabin, there were no meaningful physical barriers. What existed instead was something more precise and more unsettling, a set of unwritten conditions that kept that distance intact for years. The first traces of those conditions were already waiting. Once the cabin was treated as the center of the case rather than a peripheral discovery, investigators began to notice something the first reports barely mentioned. Nothing inside had been arranged at random. Objects followed repeating patterns. Tools were aligned along the same axis. Footwear marks traced short, consistent paths across the floor. A hand-drawn calendar hung on one wall, not marked with months, only numbered sequences interrupted by simple symbol. There was no attempt at comfort, but there was consistency. Someone had lived here according to rule. The notebooks confirmed that impression. They were not journals in any conventional sense. No emotional entry, no explanations addressed to a future reader. Instead, they contained fragments, list, time block, conditional statement, silence after the long sound. Wait, 2 cycle. Do not answer if the question comes early. None of these notes explained them. They read less like reflections and more like adjustments, as if each rule had been tested, failed once, defined. What was most striking was what wasn't there. No letters written and abandoned. No recorded attempts to justify the situation. No plea. This absence runs counter to almost every documented case of prolonged isolation. Instead of expression, there was instruction. The cabin did not function as an emotional refuge. It functioned as a monitoring point. When those fragments were cross-referenced with external data, a disturbing alignment emerged. The time blocks marked for silent corresponded with the same windows in which highway sensors had failed. Symbols on the calendar appeared only on days when maintenance crews logged brief stops along the road. No causal link could be proven, but the overlap was exact enough to force a reconsideration. Amelia had not withdrawn from the outside world. She had been watching it. One detail sharpened that conclusion. Near the doorframe, investigators found vertical marks carved into the wood, grouped in 3s and 4, cut over older marks in the same location. Analysis showed they were made with the same tool over several years. They were not tally marks for days. They marked events. Something had happened repeatedly, often enough to require tracking, rarely enough to demand caution. This is where the second major rupture occurred. The central question shifts again. It is no longer why Amelia didn't leave. The evidence suggests a more precise formulation. Why she chose to stay exactly there. The proximity to the highway stops looking irrational and starts looking necessary. She needed here to notice changes, to remain close enough to detect subtle shift, but distant enough to avoid being absorbed into routine visibility. There is no clear evidence of physical coercion, no restraint, no locked doors, no explicit threats recorded. What emerges instead is something harder to define: strategic adaptation. At some early point, still not clearly identified, Amelia appears to have learned that crossing those 50 meters required conditions to be met, conditions that were never written down in any official record. The chapter turns on a single discovery. Beneath a loose floorboard, separate from the other notebooks, investigators found a folded scrap of paper. Same handwriting, same steady pressure, but pressed harder, as if written with intent rather than habit. It contained only one sentence: "They don't stop you, they wait." No date, no explanation. That sentence resolves nothing, but it reframes everything. If no one was stopping her, then her continued presence was not enforced by visible force. It was enforced by anticipation, by expectation, by a reading of the environment that made leaving feel more dangerous than staying. The chapter closes on an absence that can't be filled. The rules exist, the records prove that. What they do not reveal is who defined them first, whether the environment imposed them, whether other people shaped them indirectly, or whether Amelia herself constructed them by interpreting signals no one else chose to acknowledge. Between the road and the cabin, something operated flawlessly for years. Not a barrier, but a system, and no one can say with certainty whether it is still in place. This file does not end with resolution. It ends where the investigation itself runs out of leverage. Everything that could be measured has been measured. Everything that could be compared has been aligned. Amelia's presence was real. The rules inside the cabin were real. The duration was real. What remains inaccessible is the final motivation, the point at which explanation stops being supported by evidence and becomes speculation. What can be stated with confidence is this: the disappearance was not sustained by wilderness, nor by technological blind spots alone, nor by a single human error. It persisted through something quieter and more durable, the convergence of expectation and silence. Each person who passed that stretch of road assumed someone else had already looked closely. Each agency assumed another unit had covered what was obvious. Each incomplete record was accepted because it did not openly contradict the prevailing conclusion. Removed from its setting, the cabin loses power. In photograph, it looks small, temporary, almost fragile. The unease only returns when it is mentally placed back where it stood, within daily auditory range of traffic, inside a landscape defined by repetition and routine. The question that lingered is not, how could this happen, but why was it allowed to feel normal? The sentence found beneath the floorboards, "They don't stop, they wait," remains officially uninterpreted. Some dismiss it as late-stage paranoia. Others read it as metaphor or as a coping framework built over time. None of those readings can be verified. What is clear is that, for Amelia, anticipation carried more weight than any visible barrier. Expectation functioned as restraint. This ending offers no culprit because the case resists that structure. What it exposes instead is something less comfortable: how easily systems learn not to see what sits too close to established routine. Amelia Harper did not vanish into absence. She persisted within proximity, audible, reachable, theoretically visible, and was rendered invisible by assumption. The file closes, but the condition it describes does not. If a person can exist for years within sight of ordinary life without being recognized, then disappearance is no longer an exceptional event. It becomes a structural possibility, and that possibility does not end with report or discoveries or delayed recognition. It ends only when someone decides to cross the 50 meter, not of distance, but of attention.